All right. Well, thank you guys all for being here. I think, let me just say that I really enjoy the in-person strategy workshops that we've done in the past, and I know a lot of you have participated in them, but I'm so excited by the number of people that are able to participate because we're doing this virtually. It's a big help in my perspective. We're going to take some time to walk through the reports, and just to give you kind of a sense, we're going to deal first with the technical stuff, which is making sure you guys feel comfortable unzipping the reports and opening the reports and that sort of thing. We're also going to spend some time talking about kind of the interpretive pieces of it. What does each of the data visualizations mean, and how do we make sense of the results? And then the last piece of it is we're going to take some time to talk about how we might deploy the data in different ways. So thinking more about strategy. So what is it that makes sense? What are things you might want to share with your deans early on? What are things that you might want to do with different constituent groups because the data is available to you? That sort of thing. I'm going to start a screen share momentarily so that we can all get a chance to look at things together. So let me move you all over. And if you guys can just confirm with me when you see my screen.
It's there.
All right. This is the cleanest my desktop ever looks. It gets this clean once a year. So when you all received your reports, I want to just talk about what was in the package. There are a few pieces in there that we're going to go through. The first one is the cover letter. So the cover letter is more than just kind of pro forma this year. A lot of things have happened in the last 6 months, from the pandemic to issues of race and diversity and equity and inclusion. And so this year, we took a little bit of extra time in that letter to really create for you a packet of resources that can help you think about how you can deploy your data to face some of the challenges that maybe you didn't think of as coach related, but coach can be a tool in your toolbox for addressing them. And so I encourage you to look through that content, to think about it, and we'll go through some other resources that are there as well. The second piece that you have is what we call, I believe it's labeled as a summary report, and I'll show you how that summary report is created in just a few minutes, because you've actually got the ability to reproduce that within your zip file. The last piece is this is a zip file, which you'll see, and I just want to show folks to make sure you're all comfortable with this. When you get a zip file, you need to right-click on it and hit Extract All. And when you do, you can essentially set up the location where you want to save. If you don't take this step, the functionality in the report will not work the way that we want it to. So you hit Extract, you'll see here it unloads or unpacks the report for you. And depending on the location where you've saved it, it'll drop the folder right there. So in just a second, we should have that, and you get this report. When we double click on this, you're going to see these two folders and a document that has a Chrome logo. These two folders contain all of the data for your reports. So we don't want you to play with that necessarily. All you need to do is click on this Coach 2020. In this case, it would be, and it will open up in your Chrome browser and look like this. Is everybody seeing my report? I see heads nodding, so I'm going to assume we're in good shape. So a few things about navigation before we jump into the whole thing. Our team has spent a good bit of time making sure that you have all the resources that you need in order to be able to work through the reports. So throughout the reports, you're going to see these videos like this one here where it says watch the quick guide, and it talks to you about navigation. Every single view has some sort of either video tutorial or a kind of a pop-out with text instructions on how to read and interpret your results. So always look for those little logos. Another thing I want to just touch base on really quickly is these guides and articles. We've taken some time to really think about not just how to read your report, but also to think about practices and policies and programs that make sense. And so you're going to find all these articles here. And some of it is coach research, and some of it is work from other scholars that are studying higher education. All of these pieces of content are available to you, not just in your report, but also on the coach website. Please take advantage of the work that we're doing to help you make sense of the data. We have some great resources on there about how to use coach data to respond to COVID-19. We talk about the importance of coach data for thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have so many resources, and we just want to make sure that you guys realize that that's something that your coach partnership pays for. And we want you to take advantage of it, so please do. Circling back to the beginning, I want to talk about that preview report. So this is the preview report right here. And this is that summary, which you've already got a PDF version of. But if you needed to produce a new version on your own, you would simply click on all pages. And what you're going to get here is a nicely produced document, which you can then convert to PDF and save on your page. This is a very high level set of results. And so you can see here, we've got your peers and your response rates and some strengths and concerns, as well as some visualizations of top level analysis. So these are your benchmarks, which we'll talk about what those benchmarks mean and kind of what this visualization means a little bit later in the presentation, as well as some kind of items about global satisfaction, best and worst aspects, and that sort of thing. So all of that's built right into this report. And the reason I share this early, and one of the reasons that we built this into the reporting platform, is as you start to think about how you want to share things with your faculty, this is a really safe way to start the conversation with them, to get them thinking about coach. It's high enough of a level that people can just think about the issues broadly. We don't need people wondering what the answer to Q137A is. That doesn't matter for the beginning conversations with your faculty. In the beginning, we just want them to think about, governance, tenure and promotion policies. Kind of what are the big ticket items that we're thinking about as we roll through the results. This gives you a chance to do that, and it's also a way for you to be transparent with your faculty early on, because you're sharing, at least a first blush of the results, and then to talk about what the next steps are going to be. How are you going to drill deeper into the reports, and how are you going to share it with them? But this is a very easy, accessible format to do that kind of work. I'm going to just pause for a second. I want to show you one other thing. If you want to produce this report as a PDF to share, simply hit Control-P on your computer, and instead of having a printer, just say Save as PDF. Make sure that your layout is set to landscape. And one other very small detail, but it will make a big difference in your results. There's a checkbox that says background printing, and that is in this more settings, which seems to be locking up on me. Just make sure your background colors are on, otherwise you lose some of the visualization. So. And my computer locked up.
It looks like Caroline Simpson has her hand raised. If you want.
Caroline, can we, while we're waiting for my computer to stop freezing here, would you want to tell us your question?
Yeah, I was just having difficulty because I'm on a Mac, and it just took me a little while to figure out how to do that. Mm-hmm. I got up the printing page. Please don't ask me how, because I forgot. I randomly hit a couple of keys, and there it was.
And there you go. Well, I'm glad we could fix that for you, but no, that's great. All right, so I'm going to cancel out of this, and we're going to go back to the report home. And we're going to talk a little bit about the report views within here. So a couple of things to note. one of them is about response rates. And I always start with response rates. People are always really concerned about whether response rates are good or bad or high or low. And we'll talk a little bit about that, but I think there's a couple of other things that are also important here. For us, you could have a small liberal arts college with a 70% response rate, and all 70% are, white guys. That's a reality. So while we think a strong response rate is important, a representative response rate is more important. So as you look across at response rates, we want to really look for variations within groups. So, it looks here like there's relative consistency across groups, except for this group of faculty of color, where they're saying only 30% completed the survey. So when you look at response rates, think about it more as a way to focus your conversations with audiences who maybe didn't participate as much in the survey. So there may be some value in having specialized conversations with faculty of color. The other thing that we've got here are your selected comparison institutions in the cohort, and I want to explain what those two things mean. So when we talk about selected comparison institutions, those are those 5 peers that you got to select for your report, the schools that you think are most like you. So when you see selected comparison institutions or peers, that's what it's referencing, the 5 schools. When we talk about the cohort, that's all the institutions for the past 4 years that look like your institution. So either research universities or baccalaureate institutions or community colleges. Kind of the broad field is the way that we think about that. And you can see, obviously, based on the size of the number of records in here, that's a pretty big group, because we're looking at a sample report that's comparing to research universities. A second definition that I want to go over, and I really want to make sure that if you guys have questions about this, that we clear it up early, because it will have implications as we read more into the report, is this the questions of how we define race in reporting. So white faculty are pretty much straightforward. It's folks that either in the population file or in the survey identified as being white. Anyone who did not identify as being white is coded as a faculty of color. And so this is, again, pretty straightforward. If you're not white, then you're in the faculty of color group. But our data tell us that Asian faculty in some dimensions of the survey respond differently than other faculty of color, and we wanted to provide that level of nuance for you. So in addition to white and faculty of color, we have Asian faculty. And then the last group here is URM, underrepresented minority faculty, and that's anyone who is not white and is also not Asian. So I'm going to pause for 30 seconds just to see if we get any hand raises or questions, or my definitions are just getting better. I see, looks like Robin has a question, and Heather. Robin, do you want to, I'll unmute you and you can.
Sure. My question is whether, how Hispanic faculty fit in. So for all white faculty, does that mean all white non-Hispanic?
Great question. That's correct. Non-white or white non-Hispanic is
And
what.
so then for Asian, is it Asian non-Hispanic? And then URM is everything else that's not Asian or?
Yeah, I don't think there's I don't think we make an Asian non-Hispanic distinction. So if you are Asian, then you'll fit into the faculty of color group, but not into the URM group.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Heather, I see a hand raised over there.
Yep. Does URM include unknown and other?
It would include other. In terms of unknown, it's actually a really good question. Let me talk you through the process by which we get our race data. So for, as I'm sure all of you are aware, in your population file, we ask for race data. And for the most part, institutions are able to deliver that. There are some exceptions to that. If a respondent does not take the survey, then we use the population file data. If the person participates in the survey, we actually ask them for their race data, for them to identify their race. And we do this also with things that affect the adaptive branching in the survey, like rank and tenure status. But for these really important demographics, we re-ask it in the survey. And if their response differs from the population file, we ask them a second time. And if they confirm a change in both the first response and the second response, then we recode them. And so this plays out in a few different places for us. Race is one where we see it more often. Sometimes in things like tenure status, if we happen to be running the survey and somebody gets tenure between when the population file was built and when they completed the survey, it can create an adjustment there. But we always start with the population file, double check with the respondent, and then if there's a disagreement, we'll double check again. That eliminates almost, I would say 99.9% of any kind of missing data issues that we might have with race or things like that. If somebody is not coded, if somebody doesn't have a race code because they were in the population file and they somehow refuse to answer that question, then they wouldn't be included in a race group. They'd essentially be missing from that analysis. They wouldn't be missing from the overall score, but they would be missing from the disaggregations by racial groups. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Great. Matt, I see you're up there.
Actually, you've already taken care of my question, so we'll stop bombarding you from the University of Delaware for a minute.
No, that's all right. Megan, how about you?
Now I'm unmuted. Okay, I had a question about gender identity. I see we have men and women. Is there an option for gender non-binary, or are you moving in that direction?
So yes, we are. So the way that we've reframed our question for this year for the first time, and Kieran, I'm going to ask you to make sure I get this right because I know we've gone through a few different iterations of this, but we begin by asking whether they identify as I believe the exact wording is man or trans man, woman or trans woman, gender non-conforming, gender queer, and then we don't use the phrase other, but we say not listed above, please specify. The following question is, do you identify as trans, as a trans person? And that gets us the gender issue as well as trans status in as few a questions as we could come up with. And for the I should just mention for the other question or for the not listed above response, people can free write in whatever it is that they identify as. That help?
Yep, that does it. Thanks.
Great. We really tried, we spent a good bit of time this past year really rethinking that question and making sure that it was inclusive because, when you ask that sort of question early on, you run the risk of really making someone feel disenfranchised just in the way you've asked the question. And for us, it's a really important piece of data to be collecting as things change. And we know that institutions don't necessarily have that data because, a faculty member that became an employee in the 1980s or 90s, nobody was even asking those sorts of questions. So we've got to collect that data on our end. Circling back to, it looks like we've got no more hands. So circling back to the response rates, I just want to note a couple of things here. In addition, if you did provide divisional data, you'll see response rates by division. And just like seeing those lower response rates in particular subgroups, we also want to make sure that, when one division has a much lower response rate than others, that we're thinking about how to share the results with that division in a way that brings them more into the conversation. Strategically, we tend to think about the reports not so much as a report card, but as a way to facilitate discussion with your faculty. The results are the way you generate good questions with them. And so when you have a lower response rate amongst a particular group, that's not to say that their voice isn't important or doesn't matter. It's just an opportunity for you to engage them in a different way. So circling back to the report home, let's go right into analyses and visualizations. So the first place that we're going to talk about are these benchmarks. Now, benchmarks are really important because they give you this top level understanding. The benchmarks are kind of the thematic organization of the survey. And so when we talk about benchmarks, it's really 5, 6, 8, sometimes 10 or 12 items that are all on a 5-point Likert scale, and we've averaged the scores together. We don't do any kind of weighting. We don't do any kind of transformation of the data. We simply average out the scores for each of the items that are included in there, and then provide you with your institutional data. So when we look at the benchmarks, the first view I want to share with you is these benchmarks at a glance. And just like before, we've got your videos to teach you how to do this, but we'll go through it together. So our survey has about 25 benchmarks, which you're seeing across the bottom: support for research and service and teaching, tenure policies and tenure clarity, and items about shared governance and leadership. The point here is not to drill down to those very specific items, but to just think broadly about the subjects. Now, this visualization, as I said before, represents the 5-point Likert scale that is included in most of these items. And so each of these lines represents one of the schools in that cohort, that all group. And the red lines represent the bottom 30%, the gray lines represent the middle 40%, and the green lines represent the top 30%. And so very quickly, you can kind of get a sense of the range and the spread, and you can see things like, oh, wow, nobody seems to be doing particularly well in interdisciplinary work, and that's tells you something about where it is that the field might be struggling a bit. The black diamond represents your score. So in this case, it's a 2.75 on a 5-point scale for interdisciplinary work. The 5 circles represent those peers that we talked about, the selected comparison institutions. And then, as I said before, the individual lines represent the cohort. For institutions that have participated with Coach more than once, we've got this black line here. That's your previous score, which shows your change over time. So very quickly, as we look at this, we can see in terms of interdisciplinary work that it looks like, they're somewhere around the 70th percentile, near that upper group, the green lines. Not outperforming the 5 peers, but there's been an uptick since the last time. So let me pause for a second, and let me give you another example while we're thinking about it. When we look at faculty leadership, this institution is nested very well in that top 30%. Again, has shown improvements over time and is outperforming all 5 of its peers. This is the case where we would consider this a real area of strength for the institution, something to celebrate. If, on the other hand, and this report doesn't really have a good example of it, you were in that bottom 30%, the red bars, and lowest amongst your peers, that would be something we would list as an area of concern. So all those things, as we kind of fold them together, give you this big picture sense of where it is that you're in the field, where it is that you are in comparison to those near peers, and then also, if available, that change over time data. Now, here's the cool thing about this report. When we go here, we can select the exact same analysis by subgroups. So in this case, let's just say we want to really think about associate professors. How did things change? And very quickly, now we're looking at just associate professors compared to just associate professors. Or if you've got a faculty commission on women, you can break out this group just to show women. Or for your chief diversity officer, maybe you want to say, here's some things for you to think about in terms of your faculty of color. And look at this. All of a sudden, we see some real changes. We see some real movements. So even though you were knocking it out of the park for all these benchmarks, there are some real areas to work on for your faculty of color. And that's what this report does. And again, the great thing about this is the kind of view that you can print out and you can use as a PowerPoint deck to start sharing with your faculty. And it's intuitive and it's easy for people to get. All you have to know is that higher is better to get some sense of where things are. I'm going to pause for a couple seconds and let you guys see if there are any hand raises. And Lauren, I don't have the chat box open, so if you could keep me posted if there are messages that are appearing in the chat.
Nothing yet.
All right.
On a roll.
So let's go back here. Now, if,
Oh, sorry, something just popped up. Mariah asked, why is associate professors missing some categories?
that's a great question, and it'll actually appear later on. So in the survey, we make a really concerted effort to only ask faculty questions that they feel like, or that we feel like they can answer accurately, and also that that they really have a good informed sense. And by doing that, it creates these adaptive branching paths through the survey. So the areas that we're missing for associates are about tenure and promotion policies, which they've already been through that process, and we're really much more interested in how junior faculty feel about that. So we don't ask them those sorts of questions. We also have some adaptive branching, and this will apply to liberal arts colleges around things like divisional leadership. Most small liberal arts colleges don't have as robust a divisional structure. They really report directly to the provost's office, so we don't ask them questions about their, the dean of engineering when they don't have a dean of engineering, that sort of thing. So you'll see that throughout, and I'll show you where that plays out in different sections of the report. But thank you, great question. So the next view we're going to jump into is this demographics view of the benchmark dashboard. Now, what we're looking at here is really just the same view that we saw earlier, but it's all compacted into a single page, and it provides even more data, which I'll go over in just a second. So for the purposes of this report, we're going to start just by looking at the overall column, which is kind of where I started with the last view. And the triangles represent your performance relative to the peers as well as to the cohort. So the triangle that points to the left, at this top one, you can see it's red. This triangle represents your rank compared to those 5 peers. So if you're ranked first or second, you're going to see a green triangle. If you're ranked third or fourth, you're going to see a gray triangle. Fifth or sixth, you get a red triangle. The triangle pointing to the right is your percentile ranking within the cohort or the all group. So if you're in that top 30%, then you'll have a green triangle. And if you're in the middle 40%, you're going to see a gray triangle. And if you're in the bottom 30%, you'll see a red triangle. So very quickly, you can scroll down this and you can see where it is that you're doing well overall. So an area of strength would be anything where you see 2 green triangles. An area of concern would be anything where you see 2 red triangles. And these other pieces are kind of more in the middle of the road. What's nice about this view, though, is you can see all those subgroup analyses very quickly. So now we can just look in the second column is just tenured faculty compared to tenured faculty elsewhere. And just associates compared to associates elsewhere, and just women compared to women elsewhere. And circling back to that question, you'll see here where there's NAs, that's indicative of questions that weren't asked because of adaptive branching. Now, another thing you might see in your reports is N is less than 5. These reports are built so that anytime we get to a subgroup analysis where there are fewer than 5 respondents, it's going to mask those results. So even at schools where, let's say, you've got enough faculty of color to report out overall, when you combine the overall count with the subgroup cuts that we need to make because of adaptive branching, you might see an N is less than 5. So at a smaller school where you've maybe got 20 faculty of color and maybe only 5 of them are on the tenure track, they're the only ones that get asked the questions about tenure clarity. So once we get below 5 for that subgroup of pre-tenure faculty of color, it filters that out. And so you should not ever be concerned about sharing these sorts of dashboards and potentially risking sharing identity. It's already baked into the reporting platform that it's not going to share those small results. So let me pause again for a second and just see if we have any other questions that have popped up either in the chat or if there's a hand raised, but then I'll go to the other side. All right. So if everything on the left side of this view has to do with your external comparisons, and everything on the right side is internal. And so what we're looking at here is your tenured faculty compared to your pre-tenure faculty, or your men compared to your women, and your white faculty compared to underrepresented minority faculty. And in a perfect world, this whole section would be blank. So when you see no data, no names, no word, no text at all in the cell, that's telling you that there's relative parity between the groups on that particular subset of items. The reason that that we share this view, though, is because we know that different faculty by demographic groups experience the academy differently. And we want you to understand not just whether or not women are more or less satisfied than women elsewhere, but whether women and men are experiencing things differently on your campus. And that's what this view does for you. So looking at this, when you see a name in the cell, and I'm just going to use this top level here where it says men versus women, and you see women on the row for nature of work research. That's telling you that there's a small effect size difference between the scores for men and women on this particular benchmark. And it's when there's no fill in the cell, that's telling you it's small. When you see a yellow box like this one here for associates, that's telling you that there's a moderate difference. And when you see orange, that's telling you that it's a large effect size difference. And so very quickly, you get a sense of both the directionality of the difference and the magnitude of the difference. The other exception that we have here is these little plus and minus signs under the 2018. So if your institution has participated more than once, you're going to see this column populated with little pluses or minuses. A plus indicates an improvement since the last administration. A minus symbol indicates a decline in your scores. And the same thing with coloration. The darker the color, the bigger the change, the bigger the magnitude of the change. So very quickly, as you look through a report like this, you can get a sense of not just how you're doing overall, but how you're doing by subgroups, and you can compare your internal comparisons to your external comparisons to determine whether or not those problems are unique to your institution or whether or not they are more in line with kind of the field as a whole. I'm going to pause for a second and see if we get any hand raises. Tim from Emory.
Yeah, you lost me on the sort of the specifics of the right-hand side. I get the large differences and how that works, but I'm curious about which direction it cuts, right? That's the part I didn't quite get. Like, so if I see in mentoring tenure, they think they view mentoring better or worse, how do we measure the direction?
Think about it this way. It's the group that warrants your extra attention that shows up in the cell. So when you see this whole column of associates compared to fulls, and associates are much lower, that's telling you that associates are less satisfied on all of these different dimensions, which is one of the ways to think about this report is that you can think about it thematically, like support for research and teaching and service, or departmental leadership, and that's one way to cut through the data. Another way, though, and this report really kind of highlights something like this. Another kind of way to think about this is who are the audiences that either we need to dig in deeper with, we need to have more robust conversations with, or that clearly need more interventions. And so you've got this kind of thematic approach, or you've got a demographic approach, and most folks kind of do a hybrid of both. Does that help, Tim?
It does. I just wasn't sure it was higher or lower, and so if it's highlighted, it's lower than the reference group. Perfect. Thank you.
No problem. Other questions? Anything popping up in the chat, Lauren?
Yep. Carol has asked, how are individuals who don't identify as women or men being accounted for in this data?
So that's a great question. So if in the event that we don't have, either because they didn't disclose it and it wasn't in the population file, or if for whatever reason, if they chose to fill in their own response for this, they would not be included in the analysis by gender. And quite frankly, we don't get enough data for a single institution in order to report by kind of non-binary or genderqueer, those sorts of different demographic groups. We just don't get enough counts at a single institution to do it. So we only take the folks who've identified as men and compare them to the folks who've identified themselves as women. That help? All right, I think if it's still quiet, I'm gonna jump around a little bit more. So this view, like I said, kind of gives you that overall sense of how things look. Now we've got a different view, and this is our disciplinary view. Now, many of you will remember that we asked you to code your departments into what we call academic areas. And the reason that we do that is so that we can provide you with external comparisons to those groups. And so here we've got the same kind of data visualization. I'll explain the white triangles in a moment, but the same kind of visualization. And what we're doing here is we're saying, instead of comparing tenured professors to other tenured professors, we're comparing humanists to other humanists, and social scientists to other social scientists, and you know, business faculty to other business faculty. And we use the same metrics to compare them. So it's the same thing, ranking and percentile placement. And we do the internal as well as the external comparisons. Now, the reason that this matters from our perspective is twofold. First, we have a whole bunch of liberal arts colleges in our cohort this year. Those liberal arts colleges don't necessarily have the divisional structure that allows them to think about things by discipline. And this allows you to do that sort of cutting. The other reason that we do this is because we know that, you know, colleges of arts and sciences in particular are these big, complicated organizations that have, you know, lots of different disciplinary groups. And so if you're working with a dean of arts and sciences on these results, having this kind of disciplinary breakout might help them to be a little bit more precise in the types of interventions that they do. The one thing I will mention here, I just want to be clear on, is when you see the name of the disciplinary group here, and in this case, it's saying that humanities are much less, faculty are much less satisfied than the rest of the institution. In the event that the rest of the institution is less satisfied, or where humanities faculty are more satisfied, you're going to see this word other. It's kind of our imperfect vernacular, but this is telling you when there's a positive effect in that group. So humanities faculty are more satisfied than everyone else at the institution on facilities and work resources. It can get a little bit messy, so I just wanted to make sure that was clear and explained. I'm going to pause for a couple seconds, and before I pause, I just want to mention, if one of the peers from the institution, from the 5 peers that you chose, did not provide this academic area data, then you will end up with some missing data here. It can also be the case, for example, if we go back to the demographic view, that if, for example, you chose a peer that had a small liberal arts college and they had insufficient faculty of color respond to the survey, you might end up with a missing cell in this group. Or if they didn't include their non-tenure track faculty, you might see some missing data here. I'll show you where we can see that more specifically in just a bit.
So Todd, we've got one question. Actually, we've got a couple of questions now. Pamela asks, can you provide a crosswalk of the disciplines, the CIP codes included in each category?
I can provide it for your institutions. Every institution does this kind of on their own. And at some campuses, they actually don't just do a crosswalk to the department. They actually do it down to the individual faculty member. So an example might be in psychology, you might have someone who is a behavioral psychologist, and they might, or perhaps a social scientist, but you might also have somebody that does something with, neuroscience, and they might fit more into a medical field. Depending on the institution, they may have gone down to that faculty level. But for most institutions, this is going to be available to you for yourself within your population file. I can, help you whip together a quick crosswalk to figure that out if you don't have your pop file data with you. So, sorry, other question?
Yep, we've got a couple more coming up. Elizabeth is saying, I'm seeing single disciplines highlighted. Is there a way for more than one to be indicated?
No, for academic area, we ask, well, let me ask, can you clarify that question for me? Could the person who asked it?
Sorry, I come through very clearly with the chat.
No worries.
It's just that when on the other slide where you showed some disciplines as maybe, you know, not feeling that they're doing as well in a particular area, I was just thinking that there might be more than one discipline, you know, of concern. And if I recall from the slide there, you know, in each column or row, there was just a, you know, one discipline showing up in each area if there was a concern. Is that correct? Did I read that right?
So is this the view that you're speaking of? I moved back to the disciplinary view.
Oh, I see. Okay, so it's true that in a row there can be more than one area of concern.
That's correct.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Great. So any other questions, Lauren, before I jump?
Yep, we've got one from Jim at USF. He says, at my university, most of the disciplines listed represent colleges. For sciences, they listed physics and biology. But since they are departments at my institution and thus N is less than 5, perhaps natural sciences would have been a better category.
That's really good feedback. I think that's something we can absolutely consider moving ahead. And that's something too, you know, if your institution requested raw data back, those kinds of merging of departments is something that we see a lot of schools do. So they'll take the kind of 3 or 4 departments that are smaller and kind of lump them together into a group and run their own analyses and see where those groups fit in. So I encourage that. And Jim, I've been speaking with Adam pretty often, so I'm happy to connect with him on that if you'd like.
Yeah, I just noticed that because if we could combine them, maybe we might get N greater than 5, but I don't see chemistry, I don't see geosciences, you know, in there. So, but all those other categories are either colleges or at least multi-department groups on my campus. So it just seems a little weird, but thanks.
Yeah, definitely have Adam reach out to me because I'm happy to talk with him about how we can strategize around that.
And then just one last note before we move on, I did want to point out the links at the top here that say guide video and guide note. Those contain the definitions that we've been going over, so don't feel like you furiously have to take notes or you have to remember all of this. That's accessible to you.
Yeah. Great. So we've talked about disciplines, but there is the divisional component as well. And I'm going to just touch base on this very quickly, but one of the other places you can look is in this divisional analysis tab. Now, again, we're just talking about the benchmarks here. There's nothing, you know, nothing that, you know, drills down in particular on this view. But one of the things that you can do in here is you can actually filter these. And so let's just say that I want to produce a quick report for the dean at this law school. What I've done here is I have highlighted the law school scores across the board. And at the same time, I'm showing the other divisions. So the dean at the law school can see, you know, his or her performance relative to the rest of the institution. They're clearly doing something really well when it comes to collaboration, but looks like they might be struggling on divisional leadership. That's, you know, something that a dean should be able to work on. And the nice thing is that you can print this view for them, share this, and they don't know what the other divisions are. They just get a sense of their relative placement. So it's a way to start a conversation with your deans. And you can, of course, produce one of these for every single dean just by using that control feature. So as you think about sharing out your results with deans, and this is a great way to start the conversation. Now, let's jump back to the report home. And there's a couple of other things I want to show you. So we started with the benchmark dashboard. And as we looked at it, we could see there are certainly some areas to work on. I want to think a little bit about this departmental engagement. What does that mean to faculty? Because clearly they're struggling across the board on that dimension. So you go back to your homepage and you go to this thematic breakout. And when you do that, you've got a group called the department, which includes all the questions related to departmental engagement, departmental quality, departmental collegiality. And so when we click on this view, very quickly, we jump from just thinking about the benchmark to thinking about the individual items that comprise the benchmarks. And so when you want to say what dimensions of departmental engagement are my faculty struggling with, you can actually start to see it right here. And you can, again, use the exact same iconography to understand that, that certain subgroups are more or less satisfied than other subgroups. And just like before, we've got the demographic analysis, we've got the disciplinary analysis. But here's the other feature. You guys all know, as we talked about, the kind of the sensitive open text comments, that we have a lot of qualitative data. Our staff have gone through, read those comments, and coded them thematically. So right here, once we're in the department section, you can click on related comments and immediately it pops up with all the open text responses. So as you're working with your data, what I tend to do is I start with the benchmarks. I start to think about the bigger picture. And then I say, where do I want to drill down? Because you shouldn't read through page by page because it's just so much to digest. But once I start to say, okay, I want to focus on these areas, I can go to the thematic breakout pages, and then I can read the comments, which add color and texture and depth to the understanding of the results. Now, what happens if your report is nothing but green triangles or nothing but red triangles? So when that happens, we tend to think about the global views. So there are a few questions in the survey that are really focused on the big picture. What's the best part about working at my institution? What's the worst part? If you could do one thing to change the workplace, what would be different about it? And the reason that we ask those kinds of questions is that it helps us to figure out what really is sitting at the top of the minds of your faculty. You may have really, really low scores on one or two dimensions and you think to yourself, oh, I've got to work on that. But the best and worst aspects, as well as that final question about how to improve the workplace where they can free write, can really tell you what bubbles up to faculty. Like, what's their immediate reaction? What makes them the most concerned? What's on their mind? And that can help drive things. And as I said, in particular, when things are really, really good, or things are not as, or things are really kind of poor across the board, it gives you a sense of how to prioritize your conversations, because there are, 200 to 250 dimensions in our survey, 25 benchmarks. There's a lot of data here. You can't attack every issue that you see. You've got to figure out what's most important to your faculty. And these sorts of things do that. So I'm going to take a couple minutes and show best aspects. And so, and again, we've got your guide videos and guide notes here as well. So in terms of best aspects, we ask faculty to choose from this pretty long list of, I think it's about 25 dimensions about what's the best thing about working at your institution. And at this institution, this sample report, 30% of faculty, or 37% of faculty, said that the quality of undergraduate students is one of the best dimensions. Quality of colleagues, 29%. And then geographic location was a big one, and academic freedom. So the top four are always highlighted in red. And then, of course, we do this subgroup analysis. So we see tenured faculty and pre-tenured faculty and associates. The next two columns that you see tell you whether or not the peers and the cohort feel the same way. So quality of undergraduate students, over a third of your faculty said that. It was also a top 4 item for 4 out of 5 peers and 48 out of 110 in the cohort. So it's something that makes you distinctive across kind of the general field of universities in the study. But compared to your immediate peers, it's not something that is a standout item. Now, a place that I really like to go and look is how underrepresented faculty feel about these sorts of things. So are there things that faculty of color are saying are the best dimensions about working at your institution that are distinctive? An example of this geographic location, 27% of faculty of color said it's the best aspect. Only 2 of the peers in this report say that, and a little bit more than half of the cohort. So if you're charged with the responsibility for recruiting a more diverse faculty, you might want to highlight the location as a dimension that makes your institution special and welcoming to faculty of color. You just look for, I think it's pretty consistent across the board here, but I was just looking for any other dimensions. For women, 20% of women to say that one of the best dimensions of working at their institution is the support of their colleagues is something that you should be proud of. So think about these best aspects as a way to kind of promote your institution. And when possible, look for things that are special about your institution that are not highlighted as much as your peers in the cohort. Now, worst aspects, we want to go, it's the same interpretation, but what you want is for your problems to look exactly the same as everybody else's, so that you can say, yeah, this is a problem at our institution, something that we're working on, but it's something that a lot of folks deal with. So seeing this particular dimension here, quality of facilities, was a top 4 item at this sample institution. Only 1 of the 5 peers identified that, and only about a third of the, a little more than a third of the institutions in the cohort said that that was a problem for their faculty. So that tells you that even if your report was spectacular, that you might want to think about facilities. And I want to be really clear, because facilities is a kind of a difficult thing. We know that facilities are a place that's hard to move the needle, but it doesn't mean you can't talk to your faculty about incremental improvement. So it might be that just a little bit of carpeting and paint will make a world of difference for some faculty. In other cases, they may just need to understand kind of the institutional master plan for facilities. Maybe they don't know that improvements are coming along the way and where they are in the queue. So I want to make sure you're kind of thinking about that sort of thing. On the other hand, when we come down here to the end and we say, well, what are faculty of color saying the worst dimensions of working at your institution? Well, commute and cost of living pop up pretty quickly. And that may say something about accessibility and being able to live near the campus where you work. And there are some creative solutions around those things too, that I think we can always talk about as you guys move through your data. So thinking about these best and worst aspects should help you to kind of find a general direction to think about your data. I want to pause for a minute because I've been talking for a bit longer than I wanted to, and I want to make sure that I haven't missed any questions. I see Christine's got a question.
Yes, Christiane, thank you. I may have missed this at the beginning, but I was looking at this table before the workshop, and I was struggling a little bit with it. Sort of this, because we have peers and all given just as whole numbers, right? 2 peer institutions, for example. But for us, we're getting percentages. Right, 20% of the respondents are saying, yes, it's in the top 4. The thing so that was just, I have to sort of think about this, but I also, for some columns, we have 4 things marked red. For some, we have 3 or 5. And so these are all in the top 4. Can you just sort of expand on that? Because I don't really know where the top 4 is. So 17% are saying, quality of facilities is in the top 4, right? But why do some columns have 3 marked as red and some 5? What is it that's marked red?
So the red is top 4 unless there is a tie. So I'm looking here at Asian American faculty. And
Yes.
you see that there's a tie for 11%.
And that's why you have 5.
Yeah, that's why you would have 5. I don't know why you would have 3, but it may just
In women, in the women category, you have 3.
1, 2. Huh. That's a great catch. I will.
And the same thing, honestly, in the URM, you have, oh no, you have 4, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen it before in a different table, and I can't quite make that work.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It's something that I will bring to Obi, our applications developer, who's on the call today, but I'm guessing he's not going to be able to jump in and look at the code right now. So
Okay, thank you.
We'll take a look, but thank you for pointing that out. Great. Other questions? I don't. Let's see. I don't see any more hand raising. So we'll jump in then to the how to improve the workplace. So here is the quantitative coding of the questions in the survey, the final question in the survey, which is, what's the one thing your institution could do to improve the workplace for faculty? And as I'm sure you guys can imagine, it's sometimes hard to get faculty to stick to just one thing. So from our perspective, we tend to overcode rather than undercode. And so you will find things that fit into multiple categories, and I'll show you how that manifests itself in just a moment. But what you're seeing here is the percentage of times that a response ends up in a particular code. So, in alignment with what we just saw in best and worst aspects, facilities is apparently an issue when faculty free write. 32% of comments were coded into facilities and work resources. Now, when you want to look at the actual comments, you can see as we scroll down here that you've got that ability to do, and you've got the ability using this control display to filter by those different groups. So you just click on the radio button. Now, from a functionality perspective, we had to make this a radio button and not a multi-check because we wanted to make sure that we weren't missing any comments. But if you just want to see comments about nature of work in general or research or service, they're all kind of, the functionality is built right into here. Now, the other thing that I want to show you are these little boxes underneath. So in this case, the comment was coded into more than one theme. So we've got, in this case, better financial support for tenure track and tenured faculty who are struggling to get NIH level funding and keep their programs viable. So it was coded into facilities and resources for work and support for research. And as you go through each of these comments, you'll see these little boxes below them. And what that's going to allow you to do, because, and this is something that's, it's a matter of functionality. We build the survey, we build the report, and we organize things into these compartments. But what this allows you to do is see when comments bleed into each other. So when you see that, facilities and resources for work is a recurring issue, and you see that it also relates to support for research, then the case becomes that facilities and support for research are related to each other. And that's the kind of more complicated narrative that you can get to by reading these open text responses. Now, related to this, I just want to mention this, and Obi's on the call, so but one of the things that we can do for you or work with you on is actually creating a text-free version of this report. So if you want to put your report up on a publicly shareable site, but you're concerned about your open text responses being up there, there's a way for us to essentially delete that section. And what will happen is you'll see, for example, this visualization, but it won't have the open text responses underneath. So anytime that you think you might want to do that, and I'll tell you that institutions have really gone kind of the gamut on this sort of thing. So, if you had asked me 5 years ago how many schools were publicly sharing their full report, I probably would have guessed about half. Most institutions are now putting up some variation on the report, but they're thinking differently about the open text responses. So the example that I think of is Hamilton College put up their open text or their report without open text comments. So when you go to their university website, you can just type in coach and you can actually see all their results. But when you go to the open text section, if you click on the links, it just says, site not found. Then we have other schools, and some of our CUNY partners who participated last year, where they've put everything up there. I believe San Jose State University also did this, where comments are included and they're shared publicly. You get to make that decision. I encourage you to do it collaboratively with your team and with other important constituents. But I think it's okay to have a real candid conversation about how much you want to put out there and how transparent you feel you need to be in those sorts of settings. So before I jump to the next couple sections, I just want to ask if we've got any questions about this view. All right, so jumping back to the beginning, the last thing that I want to show you in the report is the means and frequencies. So means and frequencies, there are some folks that like the data visualizations. There's other folks that really want to just see the data. And so if you click on the means tab, what you'll see is, again, we've got those thematic breakout groups again: nature of work, resources and support, interdisciplinary work, which we label here as cross-silo work, collaboration and mentoring. And if you click on any of them, you'll very quickly get a data table that shows you your scores, the cohort average, as well as those 5 peers that you selected. Now, if you scroll across, you'll see we've got every one of the subgroups as well. And if you want to actually look at the data tables and maybe create your own visualizations, you want to do some bar charts or things like that, you can simply click here and download your table. And it pops up as a CSV file. That's available for every, means tables are available for every single Likert scale item, and frequencies are available for Likert scale as well as non-Likert scale. And I want to show you a couple things with regards to the frequency tables as well. So if we go to the frequency tables and we go to nature of work again, you'll see that we actually have to break it out by the categories within nature of work. That's because the tables just get very large and unwieldy, so we've got to really break it down. But if we click here and we produce this, you'll see you get your counts as well as the percentages. And that's true percentages, not valid percent, just to be clear on that. For our baccalaureate institutions in particular, this sort of analysis I think is really helpful because especially when you're dealing with subgroups, the ends become so small that comparing means can be a little bit tricky. There are some institutions in our cohort this year that had 6 or maybe 8 faculty of color who responded, which is enough to produce a report. But when you get to groups like that, you can really have means that kind of skew one way or the other. And so when you get down to these smaller subgroups, I really do encourage you to think about how you might use frequency data. So you might say, 20% of my faculty of color said this compared with 10% of my white faculty. So think about those sorts of things as you're doing your own analyses and you're really starting to drill down into things. But this is, again, all available to you. You simply click and download. And I should mention, you won't see it here in this report, I don't think, but you can actually, the reports are built here to use that N is less than 5 filter. So when you get to those small subgroups where you might have 3 or 4 faculty responding, it's going to be filtered out here. You don't have to worry about identifying an individual respondent. Any questions about means or frequencies?
Heather asked, what's the difference between the 2 U columns?
Yeah, so this U is all faculty, and this U is just for tenured faculty. So you'll see the red lines, the red vertical lines are your demarcation between, we call them angle groups, but they're demographic groups essentially is what they are. Other questions?
No, nothing is popping up.
All right. So I want to take a couple seconds while folks are still on the call to do a couple things. First one is we actually have Obi on the call. Obi is our applications developer. He's been with us, I think, is it 5 years, Obi? I think. He built this entire platform from scratch by himself. And we don't get to praise him enough. Obi, I just want to say to everybody in front of the the world, we're really proud of the work that you do and we're really thankful for it. And we've also got Lauren, who has been coordinating all these sessions and has really made this a smooth and seamless process. We have been doing these in person up until this year. This is the largest Zoom meeting that we've ever, the set of Zoom meetings that we've ever had, and it happens because the two of them do such phenomenal work. So I want to take a minute to recognize them. I'm happy at this point to stay on the call and kind of talk to folks one-on-one. We can go into breakout rooms, but we've hit most of the functionality in the report, and so now it's really a question of what else would be helpful for you to think about as you're moving through here.
Yeah, I'll say we do want to also go over the homework at the end of the session. So if anybody has general questions that we didn't address throughout, please feel free to bring those up now while we're all here.
Great. Lauren, do you want to go over the homework assignment while folks are thinking about questions, or do you want me to jump in? What would be?
Yeah, if you allow me to share my screen, I can bring that up and we can talk through it.
All right, I stopped sharing.
All right. So what we're asking you all to do for next week's session, if you are registered, is to identify 3 to 5 high-level issues in your report that you want to address. Pretty straightforward. To put some parameters around it so that you're not digging through every piece of data in the report, we'll just ask you to look at the benchmarks and just try to identify anything that's interesting or that might be confusing, just something that piqued your interest that you want to dig into deeper.
And I should mention, the reason that we're asking you to do that is so that we can start to see what's rising to the top for you and make sure that, as we produce content and resources and reports and analytics, that it's focused on the things that matter to your institution. So, it's kind of it's homework, but it's also market research for us to make sure that we're delivering to you the things that matter most.
Yep, and next week's session is going to be about disseminating your results and building out communications plans. So it's helpful to have in mind a few topics that you might be talking about as you start to think about what you might be communicating and how. So I see in the chat there's a question from Jack also. That instead of removing all of the comments, can you just remove 1 or 2 problem comments?
Yes, we can. I don't know that I would recommend that. It can become problematic if we're seen as editors of the data, and so I would recommend going to kind of one group or the other, or one direction or the other. But if you do see, I should say, if you do see a comment, and as I said earlier, we do spend a good bit of time reviewing and trying to redact identifying information from those comments, but sometimes something gets by our coders or there's a particular vernacular that comes out. We've even had faculty write a comment that references, something like their line of research, and it makes somebody stand out. We can go back and do a second pass on redaction of those if you want to share those comments publicly. Speaking of the open text comments, I'm kind of curious, and I don't know if anyone, for the folks that were on the session last Friday where we talked about managing open text comments, I was curious to know whether folks have had time to talk with their teams about that, whether they've started to develop some strategies for how you might or might not share your open text comments, who gets access to them, or whether there's a protocol for it. What have you guys been thinking about in those terms? Please, anybody jump in.
This is Megan. I can just jump in and say that my institution really wants to be transparent, but we are a very, very small school. And so our main concern, I think, is possibly risking that people be able to be identified by the comments that they've made. And I doubt that we're the only school that has that kind of concern.
Yeah, no, I think, especially at smaller institutions, some of these things can, they stand out pretty quickly. And to be quite frank with you, it doesn't even matter if they got their prediction right. Like if they say, oh, I'm pretty sure it's this person, even if they're wrong, that kind of little bit of that idea that's stuck in their head can become problematic for the folks who think they know who said something that maybe is, not overly complimentary, or for folks who feel like they've been outed because of the tenor of the comments. And we have an entire protocol around that sort of issue when we do our coding and redaction. I spend a couple of hours every week with our redactors, where we read comments, and when we see things like an acronym that we don't recognize, we do a lot of research into it and make sure that it doesn't identify an individual. But again, we're not on your campus, so we really do count on you guys to make that final judgment call.
One thing that we've talked about briefly, but not a lot, is sort of the faculty for whom big data is scary and not accessible versus the faculty who will want to know every minutia and the challenge of how you communicate and try and target when you have such a broad swath of audience in terms of technical skill and interest.
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's part of why we build the reports the way that we build them. Especially those views that have the lines and the circles and the diamond. We built that knowing that people could get that. Whether you are a statistician or somebody who never works with big data, you can begin to interpret those. You can begin to make sense of those, and that's really why we focus so much on those visualizations. But you're absolutely right. There are going to be folks who want to know, not just the mean, but the standard deviation and the valid end for every single response. I often think about those folks and whether or not they should be on your team. And sometimes it's great to have them on your team because they bring a richness. In fact, we were just on a call earlier today, and one of the folks on the team at that institution is a political scientist who does national polling for presidential campaigns, which is certainly got to be very interesting work. But that expertise that he brings is really valuable. I also think, and this is something for you all to it's kind of I'm trying to think of the way to phrase this properly, but when you are all thinking about those faculty members who are going to ask hard questions during the presentation, and sometimes they're hard questions because they're good questions, and sometimes they're hard questions because they just like to ask hard questions. Think about whether or not there's value in bringing those folks onto the team. Is it better to have them answering or asking those questions in a small group, engaging them in the process, and then having them present the results for you? Or do you want to manage them kind of outside the group? And that's strictly a choice about leadership style, about kind of your level of investment. But I've had some institutions that have really done some great work, and it started by having those folks that are going to be the dissenting voices, no matter what the topic is. They're kind of always the dissenter. But they brought them in and they really engaged them. They did a lot of retail work with them up front. And because of that, when they got up and presented on the results, faculty said, okay, this is credible. Because if this person is saying it's good, and I know that this person is the person that always speaks up at the Senate meetings, or then I should trust that the institution is being transparent about this. Matt, I see a hand raised from you. You want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just thinking about this question of transparency and the verbal comments, the discursive comments, and I could imagine if we chose, which I'm not sure we would, right? But if we chose to share those or some of those, if somebody saw their own comment, I mean, could they reasonably say, I didn't give you permission to do that?
Kieran, I'm going to ask you to chime in on this as well, but so this is part of what's covered during the disclosures in the survey. So I think it's very well protected by IRB. We talk about how we're going to use the data very upfront, and if they don't click I agree, then they don't participate in the survey. And I will tell you that we do get a good percentage of faculty who decide not to participate. We also get faculty who write a comment and then email me, a few weeks later. And if it's before reports are delivered, we can edit those comments. We can delete the comment. So from my perspective, I would think that shouldn't be an issue, but I would encourage you to be thoughtful about that if that's a concern for you. Kieran, do you have any comments about that? It's a good question. I want to make sure we're both chiming in.
It sure is. We try to be as transparent as possible on the consent and kind of from a IRB perspective, we're covered on this. But obviously the folks who are on this call know faculty better than anybody, know your faculty better than anybody. And there's a fair chance that there are going to be faculty who just didn't read that stuff or just will see their own comment and be surprised whether or not we've been explicit about that. So I always, we always go first to your duty of care. If you refer to the statement of data confidentiality that that the report recipient signed, that the data recipient signed as well, if your institution received data, those statements are very explicit about how you say you will and will not be using or sharing the data. So one suggestion might be whenever you're disseminating the reports, and especially those open-ended comments, especially sensitive open-ended comments, you might share that, I've signed Coach through its IRB process, required that we sign these statements, which govern the use of information that could potentially expose individual identities. So even if the person sees their comment and says, I didn't think I'd see that up there, at least they'd feel protected and know that that person is the only person in the room who really knows that is their comment. I could even joke about, saying at the beginning, like, no one knows you said this unless you self-identify. Anyway, so there are, I just like to say, like, you're covered and we're covered on this, but faculty, and it doesn't hurt to just reassure them when you're sharing these data, just how seriously you're taking your responsibilities for confidentiality.
I would also just chime in there and add to Kieran's comments that it's important to think about how you're using your qualitative data. So, you may be using it really as kind of a symbolic gesture of transparency, and that matters to faculty, and that's okay. From an analytic perspective, it may be that you don't have to share every open text comment, but you might want to hire a doctoral student or have somebody in your IR office do a thematic coding that goes beyond what we've already provided, or maybe does a deeper dive into the issues. And then you look for the qualitative comments that really highlight an issue, that make it, that make it stand out. And when you do that, and you pick those kinds of comments that really nail down a point, that can be very powerful to faculty. Another way that we've seen some institutions do it is to just simply go through and do simple counts on words like, I believe there was one institution where they did a whole report where they tried to just single out comments about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what they were able to say was, 40% of faculty in that final question talked about diversity. So clearly this is not just an issue for us because it's important, but because it's important to lots of faculty. So thinking about that approach, something else I think I mentioned last week is that if somebody at your institution wants to really go through the qualitative data, you can certainly work with your IR office or with your general counsel to generate some sort of a non-disclosure statement, or you could require that they, go through a request for the data, the qualitative data, that asks them to really articulate why it is that they want it. Because you certainly don't want people just kind of going in and being nosy Nellies, but you may want somebody who says, you know what, I'm working on this particular aspect of departmental collegiality, and I want to see comments about that. And if they've got a really compelling case for it, engage them. Even if they're not a full member of your team, they could just be somebody that's doing work, and coach can help them do their job better. Carol?
Yes, I was going to say it's a great question. I think my concern about that, and we haven't spoken at our institution, so it's not really related to us yet, but just to say in general, when you're speaking about faculty from historically underrepresented and underserved groups, and they're talking about climate and culture in text form, that could create different kinds of tension for the institution. And for the faculty who are speaking up, if we're already getting low numbers for people responding in those categories, and then you expose their comments, those numbers may go down. And I'm just curious about if there's been any trend setting. And by that, I mean, if an institution has participated in Coach more than once, and they have revealed text comments, has anyone looked at how, if that's had a chilling effect on people responding to the Coach survey?
I can't think of any specific examples of that, Kieran, and I don't know if you've maybe heard of anything. I think most institutions have really kind of found a good balance between sharing those open text responses and really thinking about what's the value out of doing that. So I think, Carol, what you just described is, kind of a double-edged sword. Yes, there's this real risk of, a comment, making someone feel marginalized if it's shared broadly. On the other hand, it could be an incredibly powerful tool for making a problem on your campus real to folks that maybe don't experience that. And so what you end up with is, you've kind of got a pro-con list. And so there are some different ways to get there. There are some different ways to get there, but I think that if you go in with kind of the right intention, that this is about us learning and growing as an organization, that most faculty will give you some space to do that. Jack?
Yes, this is Jack from Ursinus. We're still figuring out exactly what to do, but to start, what we did, and we're finding it very helpful, is working within the themes you've already provided and seeing if there's kind of a Ursinus specific theme within a theme. And I was trying to make up an example, and I did. So for example, you have compensation and benefits as a theme. So it may be the case at your institution, faculty are saying, we're underpaid compared to colleges like us, or they may be saying, our health insurance plan is terrible to work with, which, in the survey, as we have our results now, those would both fall under compensation and benefits, but we're looking for kind of another level that brings it more specific to your responses, but also keeping it within the themes that you've already provided to us.
Yeah, I think that's a really solid approach, and you're right to say we can use the existing framework, and what the qualitative data can do that a 5-point scale question can't do is really tell you how this manifests itself in the day-to-day life of your faculty, and I think that's a really powerful data point, but what you're doing, or what it sounds like you're starting to do, is you are using some of the quantitative data as a partner with the qualitative data. And we talk about this in all. Most of us on this call have been a researcher and have done your own dissertations or your own scholarly line of work. Well, what we learn from that is that all data has limitations, and that the more diverse your data sources are when they converge, the more powerful your analysis can be. And so, qualitative data may be limited because it's an individual comment, but if it tells a story that coincides with or supports what you're seeing in the qualitative data, that just adds another layer to the argument. Well, it looks like we're just about out of time. I'm happy to stay on and take one-on-one calls or conversations. I know Kiernan's on here as well, and so is Obi and Lauren. So we're happy to do that. But I thank you guys for your attention and your participation and your engagement, because Zoom is hard, and we're all doing an awful lot of it. And the level of participation we've gotten so far has just been phenomenal. So thank you all for that, and we'll stay on for anyone that wants to chat.